Hi, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Cohen. I am the Dean of Humanities at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the Arizona State University. Thanks for joining us today. According to its charter, ASU is to be judged not by whom we exclude, but by whom we include and how they succeed. Those words are revolutionary. And the reason many of us are here as faculty, administrators, and students. Why do so many educational institutions proudly boast about the number of students to whom they have denied admission, as if selectivity were a virtue rather than an embarrassing denial of access to education at a time of great need? ASU's mission of access and inclusion has never been more urgent. And that is why we're happy to be able to welcome many more people than would ordinarily fit into an auditorium to the Jonathan and Maxine Marshall Distinguished Lecture. This event culminates a week of happenings that well illustrate what we do in the humanities at ASU. Over the past week, we have had the fourth iteration of Ayanna Thompson's Race Before Race Symposium, focused upon education with a critical race studies across time bent. Last night, we had Natalie Diaz's The Power of Poetry in America, with Natasha Trethewey and Joyce Harjo, an offering of the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands, which centers Indigenous modes of thought and knowledge. These events well illustrate the kind of humanities we value here, with a world-class faculty who collaborate with our students to create a more vibrant and more just future for their fields. Many of our students are first generation, non-traditional, students of color. Our students are the nation to come. The yearly Jonathan and Maxine Marshall Distinguished Lecture recognizes that fact and gifts our community with access to some of the most important writers and thinkers of our time. We are grateful to the Marshall family for the endowment that has made this yearly event possible. We urge any of you in the audience today inspired by this event to likewise give to ASU Humanities. Drop me a line. I'm happy to speak to you about opportunities to support our mission. It is now my pleasure to turn the Zoom over to Solmaz, Sharif, and Colson, Whitehead. The publicity materials for this lecture contains their biographies, which are both, to say the least, impressive. I won't rehearse the details here since you all have them ready to hand, but I will say, among the many reasons that I'm happy to be able to welcome them today is that they are among my favorite contemporary writers. I've had the same reaction to both Colson's prose, Solmaz's poetry. There have been moments when I've had to put their books down and shake my head in awe that they can make language do what they do. Okay, here's a quick PS. If you have any questions you'd like to ask our writers today, drop them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll turn to them late in this program. And now, over to you, Colson.
Hey, howdy. Jeffrey, thanks for the lovely introduction. And thanks all you guys at ASU for coming out tonight. Well, I guess you're at home, but for tuning in. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'm in New York City. Pretty much always here. That's how we're living these days. So it sounds like you guys have had a great week of speakers. I'm honored to be in such great company. And I'm excited to talk to Solmaz. I'm going to read a bit from The Nickel Boys, my last book. It takes place in a boys' reform school in Florida in 1963. And it's for juvenile delinquents. But also if you were an orphan or a ward of the state, you get sent to this place. It was basically a warehouse for children. And our main character, Elwood, hitchhikes with the wrong person at the wrong time. It's a stolen car and gets sent to the Nickel Academy. And so we pick him up a few months into his term there. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The boys rooted for Griff, even though he was a miserable bully who jimmied and pried at their weaknesses and made up weaknesses if he couldn't find any, such as calling you a knock-kneed piece of shit, even if your knees had never knocked your whole life. He tripped them and laughed at the ensuing pratfalls and slapped them around when he could get away with it. He punked them out, dragging them into dark rooms. He smelled like a horse and made fun of their mothers, which was pretty low given the general motherlessness of the student population. He stole their desserts on multiple occasions, swiped from trays with a grin, and even if the desserts in question were no great shakes, it was the principle. The boys rooted for Griff because it's who was going to represent the colored half of nickel at the annual boxing match. And no matter what he did the rest of the year, the day of the fight, he would be all of them in one black body, and he was going to knock that white boy out. If Griff spat teeth before that happened, swell. The Nickel Academy was a reform school for boys, juvenile offenders, wards of the state, orphans, runaways who lit out to get away from mothers and entertain men for money, or to escape rummy fathers who came into their rooms in the middle of the night. Some of them had stolen money, cussed at their teachers, damaged public property. They told stories about bloody pool hall fights or uncles who sold moonshine. A bunch of them were sent there for offenses they never heard of. Malingering, mopery, incorrigibility. Words the boys didn't understand either, but what was their point when their meaning was clear enough? Nickel. The combat served as a kind of mollifying spell to tide them through the daily humiliations. The colored boys had held the boxing title for 15 years, since 1949. Old hands on the staff remembered the last white champion and still talked him up. Other things from the old days they talked about less often. Terry Doc Burns had been an anvil-handed good old boy from a musty corner of Solmaz County who'd been sent to Nickel for strangling a neighbor's chickens. 21 chickens, to be exact, because they were, quote, out to get me, unquote. Pain rolled off him like rain from a slate roof. After Doc Burns had returned to the free world, the white boys who advanced to the final fight were pikers, so wobbly that over the years, tall tales about the former champion had grown more and more extravagant. Nature had gifted Doc Burns with unnaturally long reach. His legendary combo had swatted down every comer and rattled windows. In fact, Doc Burns had been beaten and ill-treated by so many in his life, family and strangers alike, that by the time he arrived at Nickel, all punishments were gentle breezes. This was Griff's first term on the boxing team. He'd arrived at Nickel in February, right after the graduation of the previous champ, Axel Parks. His emergence as the baddest brother on campus had made him Axel's natural successor. Griff was a giant, broad-chested and hunched like a big brown bear. His daddy, it was said, was on a chain gang in Alabama for murdering his mother, making his meanness a handed-down thing. Outside the ring, Griff made a hobby of terrorizing the weaker boys, the boys without friends, the weepy ones. Inside the ring, his prey stepped up so he didn't have to waste time hunting. Like an electric toaster or an automated washing machine, boxing was a modern convenience that made life easier. The coach for the color team was a Mississippian named Max Davis, who worked in the school garage. He got an envelope at the end of the year for imparting what he learned during his welterweight stint. Max David made his pitch to Griff early in the summer. My first fight made me cockeyed, he said, and my farewell fight set my eyes right again. So trust me when I say this sport will break you down to build you up again, and that's a fact. Griff smiled. He pulverized and unmanned his opponents with cruel inevitability throughout autumn. He was not graceful. He was not a scientist. He was a powerful instrument of violence, and that sufficed. Given the typical length of enrollment at Nickel, most students were only around for 1 or 2 fighting seasons. As the championship approached, the boys had to be schooled in the importance of these December matches. The prelims within your dormitory, then the bout between the best black fighter and whatever chump the white boys put up. The championship was their sole acquaintance with justice at nickel. Trevor Nickel had started the championship matches in 1946, soon after he came on as the director of the school. Nickel had never run a school before. His background was in agriculture. He made an impression at Klan meetings, however, with his impromptu speeches on moral improvement and the value of work, the disposition of young souls in need of care. The right people remembered his passion when an opening came up. His first Christmas at the school gave the county the chance to witness his improvements. Everything that needed a new coat of paint got a new coat of paint. The dark cells were briefly converted to more innocent use. And the regular beatings relocated to a small white utility building nicknamed the White House. Had the good people of Eleanor, Florida seen the industrial fan that was kept in the White House to mask the sound of the screams, they might have had a question or two, but the shed was not part of the tour. Nickel was a longtime boxing evangelist, had steered a lobbying group for its inclusion in the Olympics. Boxing had always been popular at the school, but the new director took the sport's elevation as his remit. The athletics budget, long and easy target for directors on the skim, was rejiggered to pay for regulation equipment and to bolster the coaching staff. Nickel had maintained a general interest in fitness. He possessed a fervent belief in the miracle of a human specimen in top shape, and often watched the boys shower to monitor the progress of their physical education. The director, Elwood asked, when Turner told him that last part. Where do you think Dr. Campbell got that trick from? Turner said. Nickel was gone now, but Dr. Campbell, the school psychiatrist, was known to loiter at the white boys' showers to pick his dates. All these dirty old men got a club together, Turner said. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Colson. It's just such an honor and a privilege to be here with you today and to speak with you about Nickel Boys in particular. I imagine people might want to hear a bit about the origin story of Nickel Boys, how you came to the story, what it's based on, and how it found you.
Sure. It was the summer of 2014, and I was on Twitter, sort of goofing off as I often do. And someone retweeted a news report about the Dozier School. It was a real life school in Florida, open for 100 years, and opened in 1900, closed in 2011. And every 10 or 15 years, there'd been investigations about abuse. Kids. It was rumored that kids were being killed. They were being beaten. They were being locked up in solitary confinement. And there'll always be promises of reform, but nothing ever happened. And that was a cycle for decades and decades until it finally closed down in 2011. So in 2014, they were going to sell the property. They were excavating the known graveyard, and they found an unknown graveyard, unmarked graves, 55 kids in the ground. Some of them had died of pneumonia, and some of them had blunt force trauma to their skulls. Some of them had shotgun pellets in their chest. And over the years, parents and siblings have been told that kids had escaped from the school, and some did, and then some were in the ground. Some had been killed by the guards. And so in 2014, they were doing forensic examinations and trying to figure out who the kids were, what happened to them. And I was shocked I never heard about the place. It was covered a lot in Florida, but was not a national story except for this one day. And the next day it was taken off the front pages. And I thought, if there's one place like this, how many other Doziers are there? Maybe it's not like a reform school, it's an orphanage, but pretty much it seems, when people can exert their power over the powerless, they do. And so I wondered about how many Doziers there were. And also in the articles I started reading about the place, a lot of the survivors were white, the people who were in their 50s and 60s who'd been there as kids. And I wondered what happened to the Black kids. It was a majority Black institution, and their voices were not present in the sort of current examinations. And so I started thinking about what kind of story I could get out of this situation.
Mm-hmm. And it begs a number of questions, but one of the first ones that kind of comes to mind, this idea of it making local news and not national news, and what other invisible stories are there that might be named and kind of unearthed, and what it is in particular about literature and fiction, as somebody who also writes nonfiction, that might expand this story, or what it is that we hope will happen once it enters a novel as opposed to any other sort of medium.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the novel does, to the story or the stories of the survivors. I mean, I think there are different ways of getting at the truth, and a newspaper report, a straight history, a poem, a painting, a picture that captures the essence of a place like Dozier, and the novel, and different ways that artists use to deal with reality. I like writing fiction because I can make it up. And so I kept pretty close to the history of the school. I kept the layout, the size, and the rules and regulations, because I wanted to honor the people who'd been there. I was reading these stories of survivors, and I wanted to honor them. But I could have said it in Alaska. I could have said it in New York City, New York State. But I wanted to stick to the truth. And those kind of decisions are I think what you deal with when you try and make art out of something real. What do you want to keep? What do you want to throw out? And I think I'm making those decisions all the time. Like I have a zombie book. What do I like about zombie novels? What do I hate about them? What do I want to keep and preserve and throw out from the traditions? So I feel like I'm always doing that. In terms of what happens when a book like this gets out into the world, when it came out, people would say, well, do you think that other Doziers will be exposed? There'll be a lot of legislation about how we treat teenage offenders. And I thought, no. I mean, this place was open for 110 years because no one cares. There were various exposés, but why would you set yourself up to lawsuits? Why would you admit culpability if you're a government? Best to sort of ignore it. And I don't think we live in a culture where, sadly, the novel or certain kinds of art have that kind of centrality where we can move legislation. We can definitely stir hearts and minds and open people up to different experiences. But in terms of legislation, I think there's like Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1850s, told the North about the abuses of slavery in the South. And it really was an expose of how slavery worked for the North. There's like The Jungle up in Sinclair, exposing horrible corruption in the food industry, early part of the 20th century. But in general, the people who I think would be moved by art, moved to change legislation, don't read novels, they don't read poems, and don't really care that someone's written a book about a place like Dozier. Sort of depressing, but that's sort of, I think,
real. Yeah. There's you're reminding me of a quote by a poet named Mahmoud Darwish in an interview later in his life. He says, it's an interview with Natalie Handal. He says that he's convinced that poetry changes only the poet. And then of course we have Auden saying that poetry changes nothing, right? And so there's a way that this conversation and what we're getting at here actually kind of ties into this debate between Elwood and Turner, and between this more kind of perhaps optimistic drive, I'm putting it very simply, and then some might say pessimistic, I might say realistic, drive that's kind of embodied in Turner. And I'm curious how it is that when these two particular characters came to you, I'm sure people would love to know, and how it is that you arrived at that debate and those poles of the debate.
Sure. Breaking it down to very simple terms, Elwood believes in social progress and hope and optimism. And if you put your mind to it, you can change the world. He grew up he's 16 and 63, and he's, half his life has been spent watching Dr. King and his cohort actually change the world, And then there's Turner, he's an orphan. He's at Nicholl Academy because there's nowhere else to put him. And he believes that people don't change, and you can't change the social order. People are terrible. And all you can really do is survive and get throughout the day without getting, beaten up. So I talked about earlier about how novels don't change society, but obviously, I wouldn't write if I hadn't been profoundly affected by, various poems and stories and movies and music I've encountered in my life. You have to have hope, or else why go on? But you also have to be realistic. And I think definitely in the last 4 years, a lot of us have been wrestling with this question of how much do I believe that America can change? The whiplash of like the last, the now 2 elections ago, 2016, to go from an idea of progress to the exact opposite. So no one philosophy is complete. Obviously, a lot of us vacillate between hopelessness and hopefulness across a day, across a week, across a life. Elwood came first. I knew that I wanted to have a kid who doesn't belong at Nicholl Academy. No one really belongs. No one deserves the abuse that they get there. And like I said, as juvenile delinquents, but you get there for smoking a cigarette, in front of school. Get there for coming from a broken home, being an orphan. So I knew that he would be someone who is a straight arrow, and then as a sort of audience proxy is sent to Nicholl. We see this world through his eyes in a new way. But it's also a stand-in for, a lot of boys, a lot of brown boys, black boys who leave their houses and have an encounter with law enforcement. As I said, he hitchhikes with the wrong person. And in that moment, how their lives changed. If he'd left 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, he wouldn't have hitchhiked with the wrong person. And so many, young people, they're on the wrong corner when white law enforcement comes by. They reach too quickly for their wallet. It's a gun, the cop says, and then their life is totally changed. And so it started with an optimist, someone who shouldn't be there. And then once I had Elwood, he calls out for his opposite, just in terms of pure storytelling necessity, a foil for this very optimistic person. So Elwood gave birth to Turner very quickly.
Was one more fun for you to kind of write or embody, or did it change, or?
Oh, whenever a character tells more jokes, I tend to like them more. Mm-hmm. And so Turner has a better sense of humor. Mm-hmm. But really, when I'm with Elwood, I'm in my Elwoodness, and mm-hmm. Turner and Spencer and Jamie and the other kids, I do a lot of inhabiting, and I try to see things through their perspective. So whoever I'm working on that day is who I'm really invested in.
Thanks. Yeah. I know that we talked a little bit about, what literature can't do necessarily, or what might be an unfair burden to place on literature in regards to policy and to legislation and changes that it might enact or not enact, especially in the face of these national histories that have made these atrocities continuously just inevitable, right? This is a part of a long thread of anti-Black violence in particular. But I'm curious what it is that drew you to literature in the first place, and that sense of possibility that it offers. I know that there are some questions that we could raise around how to decide what parts of the story to tell and what parts not to tell. If it's the pleasure in that, the felicity in that, the ethics of that, what are the sorts of draws of literature?
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, or when I started when I was a youngster, or now, or
either way, if it's how dramatically it's evolved, I'd be curious. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, well, I mean, I guess I've written 10 books now, and I'm still sort of trying to figure out why or how it works, or how I end up sort of doing it. You know, today I was working, and then it wasn't really coming, and I had to go to I had to look over my office. Like, I have written books before. I know how to do it. I just have to get like into the mode again. So, you know, the work is always hard, and I think that's what makes it interesting and compelling. Like, not knowing if I can do this, a horror novel, a coming of age novel, a novel based on real life events, a novel that deals with slavery, when, you know, for a lot of my career, ironic distance was an important part of my a way of survival, and also a toolkit artistically. So I usually, you know, from project to project, you know, switch it up more. So I write a heavy book, maybe a lighter book, a shorter, longer, more structurally ambitious book, you know, a more simple book. But The Underground Railroad, which deals in institutional racism in a different sort of way, and Nickel Boys sort of go together. You know, I'm dealing with American history and these sort of systems that you've talked about that go back for hundreds of years, and we're still enmeshed in them. We're still living through them, trying to survive them. And I did not want to, you know, it was hard to write The Underground Railroad. It was very depressing, you know, and I was looking forward to writing like this nice sort of heist novel. I had an idea for a heist novel, but in the spring of 2017, and I was trying to figure out exactly what I should be working on, I decided on the Dozier school book, what became the Nickel Boys, because this personally had to sort out my ideas about what it meant to live in America in the last 4 years. Should I be hopeful or not hopeful? And then how can I take the situation, Dozier, and populate it with characters that are useful for me artistically, but also kind of emotionally. I can work through my own sort of dilemma, through Elwood's rationalizations, through Turner's survival skills, pulling back to dissect the systems that, you know, control them. So, you know, sometimes I'm in my books and sometimes not. I did feel, maybe not so much in the writing of the book, but in planning it, that Elwood and Turner were good proxies for me and my sort of internal philosophical dilemma at that moment. And then, you know, historians and journalists have to get it right. What I like about fiction writing is being able to make it up. And so I had the place where I could set my own 2 people in there and make them do what I want, and make my own sort of drama out of it. Whereas, you know, historians have that burden of, you know, they abuse it sometimes, but they have a different sort of expectation they have to live up to.
Right. And so there's a kind of real asset and not having and relinquishing the idea that you would ever have complete access to the thing itself and to knowing the thing itself. I know for the research, I mean, I guess I'll pose it more as an open-ended question. If you could tell people a little bit about your research process behind Nickel Boys, because I know there are a lot of aspiring writers as well in our audience who would love to hear about that.
Sure. I mean, you know, doing research now is fun. Definitely in college and high school, I hated it. But when actually it's your own thing that you're obsessed with, finding that great, you know, that book or account, newspaper article that sort of makes it gel for you is, you know, such a lovely moment when you find the book you need. And so for this book, there's a lot of local journalism in Florida about it. There's a guy named Ben Montgomery who worked for the Tampa Bay Times, who covered it from the Dozier School from when it closed to when they're doing the excavations. So that's like three years of, like, you know, bi-weekly reporting about this place. It's very immediate. There's an anthropology department at a local college, South Florida, University of South Florida, and they dug up the bodies, and it became like a, you know, it was a school project for the archaeology class. When this person died, what they die of, And they did a sort of autopsy of the whole school from when it opened. You know, they found bodies that had been burnt in a fire in 1920s. Kids were chained up in to their beds. The dorm caught fire, and then, of course, they couldn't escape. And so they sort of reconstructed that. And so journalism, scholarly accounts, and then a few memoirs. Some of the survivors, they call themselves the White House Boys. The White House is the torture shed. And you know, I kept that name. I couldn't really compete with the White House. And so research brings you those small details that, you know, that make the book live. And then finally, you know, survivors have two websites where over the years, as they, you know, we have a culture that promotes therapy now. And so maybe 50 years ago, they wouldn't have gotten help for what happened to them when they were kids. But now they've gotten together, the survivors, and they write 2-paragraph accounts or 5-paragraph accounts of how they got to the Dozier School. They were orphans and they were there for a year and a half. And so a lot of the slang and the way they talked and the way they saw the world just becomes this great source of material and language and slang. The same way with Underground Railroad, when I was reading first-person accounts of former slaves or interviews with former slaves, just the way they talked, and you know, informed so much of that book. They'd say, you know, in a throw-off line, you know, once a year, master would give us new wooden shoes. It's like, you got wooden shoes once a year? And it's like, that wouldn't go into a history book because it's too small a detail. But for me, I'm like, who is the carpenter? What kind of wood is it? What do you do, you know, 6 months in when you need a new shoe? And that can be a site of investigation for the book, for Underground Railroad. With the Nickel Boys, you know, I want to find arenas for conflict. So in real life, the ham radio club at Dozier School was popular. Am I going to get a lot of drama out of the ham radio club? No. I mean, maybe, you know. But probably the annual boxing match, right, with the white students versus the black students, I can expand upon that and make that a site of friction and drama, and pull some things out and pull different threads out. You know, I read for the fight, that's about, you know, halfway through the book. We know Elwood, we know Turner, we know Griff is a bully, but what is Griff's story? He doesn't deserve the terrible things that happened to him. How can I get a different perspective? And so finding different areas suggested by the research, you know, helped me out. I'm not scratching my head like what happens next or what's this place look like. I can go online, and for 60 years, they were running news reports about the annual Christmas pageant. And so I can see the stuff that the kids built. And I'd have to keep it, but I wanted to keep it to be true to, you know, to the source of the idea.
Mm. You know, as you're talking, and I'm thinking again about Griff's story in particular, and the details, and there, and my own students, there are a lot of questions and a lot of conversations that people are having in my class and outside around violence and writing and ethics, and how it is as writers we consider what details we give, portray, depict, and how we kind of go about doing that in an ethical way. And I'm so curious, I mean, I would love to hear you speak on your own kind of process behind that, and as it relates to Nickel Boys, and certainly as it relates to Underground Railroad as well. And I know this is something that you've spoken about, but I think people would really benefit from hearing from you on. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's ethics and there's also aesthetics. And so Zombie Book Zone 1, very much in the tradition of zombie literature. And so there are a lot of exploding heads, and the violence is very cartoonish, it's garish, in keeping with the genre. With Underground Railroad, in reading, you know, enslaved people's accounts of their enslavement, they describe the most terrible thing in a really deadpan style, because there's no need to dramatize it. There's no need to sell the horror to the listener. it speaks for itself. And so that sort of flat description of incredible violence became part of the narrative voice of Underground Railroad. I don't have to sell it to people. It speaks for itself. I don't need like adjectives. I can just say it plainly. With the Nickel Boys, that same sort of idea is there. You know, I'm not trying to exploit what happens. There is, you know, there's a main scene where Elwood goes to the White House and is beaten, and it has to be there because that's what actually happened to the kids. But in that scene, a 5-page scene, you never see like the leather strap hit him. All the tension comes from hearing other kids before him. You can't see what's happening, but he hears their screams, he hears the sounds, there's the anticipation. There's the reader's dread, and the reader sort of paints in what happens. You know, if you watch the movie Psycho by Hitchcock, there's a famous shower scene, and people are very traumatized by it, but you never see the blade go into Janet Leigh. You just see the blade up, you see blood in the drain, there's sound effects. The blade comes down, her shrieking, and what happens to her is all in your head, and it's just clever editing. And so, you know, I drew upon that for that scene. And then once that scene is done on page 50 or whatever, Elwood and Turner meet in the hospital, and that's where the story begins. Their sort of philosophical argument. So the scene of abuse has to be there because that's being true to life. I'm not going to shrink away, but I'm not there to like exploit it. And I really just want to get out of the way so I can get to Elwood and Turner. The same way, like, I don't want to fucking describe what the Nickel Academy looks like. It's 6 buildings, blah, blah, blah. I really just want to get to Elwood and Turner, and that's what the story is. But you have to set the scene. And so, you know, all the stuff that happens in the book, you know, the first 60 pages, I'm just like, oh, I got to describe what Spencer looks like. It's so horrible. I mean, how many people can one describe in one lifetime? Like so, you know, set the world, set the stage, and then Act 2 begins. And Act 2 begins once Elwood and Turner meet.
Thank you so much, Colson. I know that there are a number of questions from the audience, so I'd like to start posing some of them now. The first one we have are, what writers inspired and continue to inspire your writing?
Sure, I mean, it varies. I wanted to become a writer from like watching Twilight Zone, like Rod Serling. Very humanistic vision, fantastic effects, and definitely Underground Railroad is like a Twilight Zone story. Cora, a slave, gets on a train, and then like next stop Willoughby. She's in an alternative universe, and the fantasy is very deadpan. And you're on Earth, but also not on Earth. Reading X-Men comic books, Spider-Man, Stan Lee, you know, Chris Claremont, Frank Miller, late 70s, early 80s. You know, a lot of my friends who are my age wanted to like either write the X-Men, draw the X-Men, or like be in the X-Men. We're very much influenced by, you know, 70s comics, and now, you know, different depending on what I'm working on, I'm looking for inspiration from different writers. And so I knew I wanted to write a very compact book with Nickel Boys. So I was looking at novellas and short novels. So Mohsin Hamid has 2 short novels, Exit West, The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And so I was looking at how he deals with structure and compactness. Julia Otsuka has 2 really great, you know, short novels, The Buddha in the Attic and When the Emperor Was Divine. And I was just looking at them for like, when you write a short novel, what can you leave out? What do you leave in? How do you get to that, you know, that compact, concise, dense thing of beauty that is a really, you know, great novella. I'm working on some crime novels now, and so I was looking at people like Richard Stark and Patricia Highsmith and Chester Himes, just to see what I can get out of 50s and 60s crime writers. So, you know, I'll go back to an early influence with Underground Railroad. I went back to 100 Years of Solitude, and definitely that deadpan magic realism of Garcia Marquez, became a feature of Underground Railroad. And that voice is very different from the voice of Nickel Boys. And so I always try to find the right model writer for a book, and also find the right structure and voice that fits for this particular project as opposed to the previous one.
Thank you for that. Your new novel focuses on boys, but the protagonist of the Underground Railroad is Cora, a young woman who suffers appalling violence at the hands of men. Do you, as a male novelist, find it a particular challenge to write from a female point of view?
Yeah, not really. It's always pretty terrible, frankly. I'm a human being, Cora's a human being. And I think, you're supposed to, if you're gonna write about the world, you're supposed to write across, race and class and gender, just to represent the whole world. And there are all those questions about authenticity and who can write about what. And I guess since I'm talking to students, I will say, you can do anything as long as you don't fuck it up. I think if you wanna, we get a lot of bad programming from our culture, from society, our families, pop culture, about race and class and gender. And I think a lot of our, if you want to be a better person, you're engaged in an act of deprogramming, getting out all that, those bad lines of code. So it is hard to write across race, class, and gender. But I think it's also, the job of a certain kind of artist. And that's the kind of artist I want to be, someone who can inhabit different types. But if you screw it up and people in your workshop are like, it's kind of racist, don't talk about political correctness. Me, blah, I'm gonna write some op-ed, blah, blah, blah. You better next time, is my advice.
Excellent.
And so just going back to the female protagonist, I wrote a novel, everyone hated it. My first novel was unpublished. And the character was very much like me, sort of a hipster, 20-something. It was like the mid-90s. And so I thought for my next book, I will have a character who's not like me. So I'll try a female protagonist. I haven't done that before, and I might fail, but by the time I get to the last page, I'll be a stronger writer for doing something I haven't done before. My first book was first person. So what if I do a third person novel, third person narrator? I haven't done that before. And so it might not be great, but it'll be better than my first crappy book. And I'll be a better writer for doing things I haven't done before. And so it was great for me, for my artistic process, to have a female protagonist in The Intuitionist. And stretching myself, writing a horror novel, a historical novel, has been useful for me as a person and an artist. So I'll keep doing it.
Thanks. Okay. Another one we have is, you mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Jungle as legislation altering or minimally enlightening. Do you write for these kind of grandiose purposes? Why do you write?
Well, I've said that, novels don't change anything. So it would be really sort of futile to want to do that. I write because I like making things up. I feel complete when I work. If I could do something else, I'd be a lawyer or a veterinarian. I would, but I hate lawyers and I hate animals. And so actually that's not true. It's just a weird joke I make sometimes. But nothing else makes me feel as complete. So I'm a writer because there's nothing else. I don't know how to do anything else. But I have no illusions that art changes the world. I think it changes people. It changes me, or else I wouldn't be moved to be an artist. Right. But really, I'm trying to figure out the world and figure out myself. And 200 pages, 400 pages becomes a way for me to, get a little closer to an answer.
Thanks.
For me.
Okay, I have one last one here. In reviewing the language of presidential inaugurals since 1901 in a class, we noticed the tendency for presidents to focus on the future and on hope and promise. But your books and others show significant thirst and interest in reading about and coming to terms with the past. Are you optimistic that we can bring these tendencies into dialogue and toward broader and more inclusive understandings of the American story?
More inclusive. I mean, in some of my books, I'm writing about African American characters you haven't seen before. And with Nickel Boys and Underground Railroad, people have said, "Oh, I never thought about Jim Crow in that way before. I never thought about slavery in that way." And so, it's my job as a writer, I think any artist's job, to make something new. I think most stories have been told before. So why should I write about slavery when Toni Morrison has done it better than I can ever do it? I have to trust that I have something to contribute. And so, so I'm hopeful that, the book has value. I'm not sure much about presidential inaugurations. I mean, I think Trump's address is like American carnage, everything is terrible, and it's a preview of all the terrible things I'm going to do to you for the next 4 years. And I think, in terms of hopefulness for the future, reconciling American history, definitely think there's a TV show called Band of Brothers about World War II, and it's great. I watched it 20 years ago. I'm watching it again the first time. It's a really well done TV show. But I'm like, thank God, the greatest generation is finally dying off. I'm just sick of them. I'm sick of boomers. I'm sick of Gen Xers. I'm sick of millennials. The only hope is for just people in their teens and early 20s, because we screwed it up. We blew up the world. There's climate change, so we screwed it up. You undergrads are the future. Please do a better job.
Good luck. Okay. What has been the most consistent challenge you've faced throughout the writing processes of your novels?
Well, I mean, I'm good at structure, and so before I start, I plan things out. So I know the beginning and the end, and the middle can be fuzzy. But before I started Nickel Boys, I knew the major plot points. I didn't know who Jamie and Desmond were really. Harper, I think he's the white guard. A lot of the names are arbitrary and I forget them. But I knew a bit about Harper. I didn't know necessarily how he walked and talked, but I know the beginning and the end. And so structure comes easily to me, or not as hard. And so a few books ago, the narrative voice would take 80 pages to sort of congeal. And so I know what happens, but I don't know how the narrator walks and talks. Do they do big 5-clause pile-up sentences? Are they more terse, like in Nickel Boys? And so, and then on page 80, it clicks and it's oh, this is how the book sounds. And I would go back to page 1 and then bring up all those early pages to the now dominant voice of the book. Nowadays, what is hard? I don't know. I think these things are, I don't get writer's block. I think when I'm stuck, it's also a problem I haven't solved yet. So how do they get the guard and Nickel Boys to eat the poisoned whatever horse medicine? And so I'm stuck. And then I do some research, maybe I can get kicked out of my rut. And so I've done it enough times, written enough books that I know that it might take a week or a month or some long walks, but I will solve the problem. I just when I'm blocked, it's I don't know how to get someone from A to Z, or there's a structural thing I haven't figured out yet. I know what happens on page 90, but not on page 85. And so I know that eventually I'll figure it out. And so still the problem is when I get stuck, figuring out what the cure is. It more research? Do I not know enough about what I'm writing about? Is it just I need a fresh perspective and take a week off? So that.
And does the structure change often when you're in the course of?
Not so much, but maybe this character does X instead of the other character.
But the main
But-
arc is pretty much that. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, characters become more or less important. Like if I knew everything, there'd be no mystery, there'd be no point in writing it. And so definitely, oh, this person is funnier than I thought, or this book is more serious than I thought when I started,
I think maybe we can even close with this one. So Underground Railroad is being made into a miniseries. Is it scary to have this universe that you created then be visualized by someone else? Were you part of the project?
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool. It's being done by Barry Jenkins. I mean, they're doing like a 10-hour miniseries of it. I think, just from talking to other writers, when I gave them permission, it was like their thing. It's not my thing anymore. It's their vision. I have no idea how to adapt it for a screen, so I trust him. So what I've seen has been great. And one of the last things I did before the lockdown last February was go and visit a set in Georgia. And it was just amazing, here. So this is like an 1827 version of Gulliver's Travels, which I mentioned in Underground Railroad.
Yeah.
They tracked it down. And it's just like in the background of some scene. So they know, the actors know that's what it is, but it's not mentioned. And so they sent it to me afterwards. There was like 100 people that's working on, I was in my underwear in my office making this shit up. And then 100 years later, they had to build like the trap door in the cellar. I refer to a character as like, John's son. And so I'm on the set and like, oh, this is Larry. He plays Larry. I'm like, I have no idea who Larry is. What are you talking about? Then I realized, if you make a movie, you can't just have John's son. You have to name the characters. And so they named like all these people who were like appear for like one paragraph. And there's a real actor who is on set for like a month. And so they did these huge sets. It's really beautiful. And so if I didn't want to work on it because I had other ideas. And if I had worked on it, I wouldn't have written the Nickel Boys. I have a lot of book ideas. I want to get to them and I don't want to stop and collaborate. But seeing, 130 people together on the set, come together, living together for a year and tracking down all this, this stuff and making it real, which is really inspiring and crazy. And then the next week I was home for 9 months because this crazy thing. So it's a nice goodbye to the world to see, this, very lovely thing.
What a wonderful thing. Colson, thank you so much for joining us today, for gracing us with your presence, your words, and for the Nickel Boys. And thank you all as well for coming in. I think with that, we will bid each other farewell.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Stay safe and we'll see you on the other side. Solmaz, thanks so much.
Thank you, Colson.
All right. Take care.